people here were at 9:01. Macy, are there introductions or I mean, I know I'm introducing Sarah, but are there announcements or
I
other
don't I don't believe so. I think we're good to start. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Sarah Kennedy, who is a clinical child psychologist and leading researcher whose work has really shaped the landscape of evidence-based interventions for youth with emotional and behavioral health problems. So, Dr. Kennedy is joining us to present. I'm going to give a brief background about her training and work, and then I'll hand it over to Sarah to guide us through her presentation. So Dr. Kennedy began her academic training at University of Puget Sound, right here in Tacoma, go Loggers. And she then moved to Rutgers University to do her master's, and then University of Miami to continue her doctoral work. At University of Miami, Sarah focused on the transdiagnostic cognitive behavioral approaches for youth and continued this work to this day. She then went to University of California, San Diego to do internship and fellowship at Children's Hospital Colorado, where she continues to this day in a faculty role as an associate professor in psychiatry. I'm personally impressed with the geographical diversity where Sarah has lived and trained. Very impressive mapping of the United States, and even more impressed as she's established herself as a prolific contributor to the science of how, when, and to whom should receive care by studying transdiagnostic and stepped care approaches for children and adolescents. Her work can be seen in many high impact journals and has really advanced the field in key areas. And I'll just share a few here. But Dr. Kennedy is really a leading expert in the unified protocol for children and adolescents. She's been involved in multiple pilot and randomized controlled trials to inform treatment development and evaluation. She's also really worked on treatment delivery, so how to implement stepped care and telehealth delivery models to help with intervention reach. And her work also helps us to understand the ways to augment intervention impact by looking at parental responses as treatment targets and evaluating provider perceptions to guide adoption and sustained implementation of interventions that we know work. So her scholarship really reflects a combination of methodological rigor, clinical insight, and a deep commitment to improving real-world mental health care systems, which makes her a natural fit to incorporate her work into the work that we do at Suicide Care Research Center. I'm really fortunate enough to work with Dr. Kennedy on her R34 application that has integrated two existing interventions targeting executive functioning and emotion regulation for self-injurious behaviors for youth who are age 7 to 12. So many people in this room know that there's a huge paucity of interventions for youth in this age range. Well, there's a dramatic increase in the report of these behaviors, really leaving clinicians grasping at straws for how to effectively treat younger youth presenting with self-injurious thoughts and behaviors. So we are very lucky to be some of the first people to learn about this work. And Dr. Kennedy is going to describe the work of that project and get feedback to help make these interventions really targeting the right things based on feedback from children, parents, therapists, and suicide prevention researchers. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Kennedy to our Suicide Care Research Center today.
Molly, thanks so much for that amazing introduction. I feel like I should steal parts of that for my bio sketch. That was wonderful. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And let me go ahead and put this in presenter mode. I'm just going to really briefly rearrange my screen and then I'll get started. All right. So as Molly said, I'm Sarah Kennedy. I'm an associate professor at the University of Colorado on our Anschutz Medical Campus in the Department of Psychiatry. And I have indeed lived in all four corners of the US practically. But this has been my home here for the last, I guess, 7, 8 years now. I have just a couple of financial disclosures that I'm going to share on the screen before I get started. So my current funding sources, I do receive a royalty from Oxford University Press from the sale of a book on applications of the Unified Protocols for transdiagnostic treatment of emotional disorders in children and adolescents. And then I also receive payments from time to time for providing training and consultation and implementation support services on those interventions. Right. I have really three main objectives or goals today. I am really excited to be able to present to this group and get some feedback for what really truly is a work in progress. So this is really just like the perfect stage for me to hear people's thoughts. So thank you so much for attending and thanks in advance for sharing your feedback and thoughts on the work that we're doing. The first objective today is going to be just to talk a little bit about key risk factors and clinical features associated with self-injurious thoughts and behaviors in pre-adolescence. From here on out, I'll use the acronym SITBs. And when I say SITBs, I'm referring both to non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal ideation and behavior. I'll spend just a little bit of time describing how our team is using an intervention mapping approach to build a developmentally tailored treatment for pre-adolescents with SITBs. And then I'll be asking you all to kind of help me apply your clinical research and or lived experience to provide some informed feedback on our intervention development process. And I'll say a little bit more about that as I move through some of these slides. Please feel free at any point, if you have questions, to put those in the chat. I'm happy to pause and answer them. I'm really terrible at monitoring the chat when I'm presenting, though. So
I'll
Molly
do
or
that for
Macy, if
you.
you
Yep,
perfect see
happy to.
anything come in, please go ahead and stop me, and I'm happy to address questions as they come
Yep.
up. Okay. So I'm just going to begin with a little bit of context. And Molly, you already sort of shared some of this context in your introduction. But one of the things that has become increasingly clear really over the last couple of years is that the really 10 to 14 age group in particular has experienced extremely fast increases in rates of both non-suicidal self-harm and deaths by suicide. And so for the 10 to 14 age group, for example, between 2008 and 2022, there's been an 8.2% annual increase in suicide. It's now the leading cause of death in that 10 to 14 age group. There have also been similar increases in non-fatal self-harm. It's really increased most quickly, particularly in females between the ages of 10 through 12. There have been a number of publications that have come out from the ABCD study that I'm sure many of you have seen and are familiar with that have looked specifically at SITBs in pre-adolescence, and some of those publications report a 14% lifetime prevalence of suicidal ideation in kids by the time they're 10, a 3.6% prevalence of current suicidal ideation in that 8 to 10 age range, and then about 1 in 100 8 to 10-year-olds in the ABCD study have reported a suicide attempt. So this is a really, a critical public health issue that I think has very rightly, started to kind of capture people's attention, especially in the last 5 years. and something we really, need to do more for in terms of both prevention and intervention. There are, as I'm sure this group knows, relatively few empirically supported interventions for SITBs and youth in general. And then if we look at randomized controlled trials of interventions for youth SITBs that have had some sort of a significant or positive finding, only a small handful of those have included youth under age 12. So really these sort of first two studies that you see in orange here, one study of multisystemic therapy, and then another of the safety A intervention, which is a CBT and DBT informed family intervention. Even those studies have not included youth under the age of 10, and very few sort of 10 to 12-year-olds participated in those studies. And so in terms of empirically supported interventions for preadolescents, especially those 7 to 10-year-olds, there really is almost nothing, which leaves clinicians in a really tough spot in terms of making decisions about what to do and how to integrate, combine, adapt evidence-based interventions for other age groups for this pre-adolescent population. Even beyond just interventions for SITBs specifically, there are very few RCTs of youth in this pre-adolescent age range with any emotional or behavioral concern that report on SITBs. And so our group did an informal systematic review that we're turning into a formal scoping review and working on now, where we tried to survey the literature and look at any RCTs that focus on depression, anxiety, ADHD, transdiagnostic intervention targets, so diagnoses that we know are often comorbid with SITBs in this age group, just to see which studies are reporting on really any SITB related outcome or SITB related harm or adverse event. We only came up with this very brief list, and only 3 of these RCTs reported on any kind of SITB outcome. So even when it comes to evidence-based interventions for sort of other related emotional and behavioral concerns, we don't really have much of a sense at all as to which of these interventions actually might make an impact on SITBs. I think this lack of information, and I would say up until like the last sort of 5 or 6 years, the lack of information on risk and maintaining factors for pre-adolescent SITBs specifically, has really stalled the development of both preventative interventions and interventions for SITBs in this age group. However, others have argued, and our group would argue, that it's not too early to start thinking about developing interventions for pre-adolescent SITBs. In the last 5 or 10 years, there have been a number of studies that have come out. Again, many of them from the ABCD study, but other studies too, where we've started to be able to identify risk factors for pre-adolescents for SITBs. Some of those risk factors are unique to pre-adolescents or more salient for pre-adolescents. Some of those risk factors are risk factors that are true for adolescents as well. And so just to kind of provide one example, Buchanan and colleagues back in 2019, really made this argument that it's time to start developing preventative interventions for pre-adolescent SITBs, for non-suicidal self-injury in particular, because this combination of maltreatment, trait impulsivity, and emotion dysregulation are really key risk factors, especially for females with non-suicidal self-injury. And so they present in this 2019 article a really strong case for, we know enough about risk factors and maintaining factors for non-suicidal self-injury specifically in females in this age group to really be moving forward with developing preventative interventions. So just an example of sort of calls to really start thinking more about prevention and intervention in this age group. So all of this really sets the stage for our study that I'll be talking a little bit about today, and am hoping to get some feedback on. So as Molly mentioned, currently we are funded by the NIMH and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to develop an intervention for preadolescents in the 7 to 12 age range to address SITBs broadly speaking, so including non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors. And the goal of this intervention is to really address executive functioning and emotion regulation and emotion dysregulation as salient risk factors for SITBs in the pre-adolescent population. And so the overall goals of this project are to develop an intervention for pre-adolescent SITBs that targets emotion regulation and executive functioning, in addition to other SITB relevant risk factors, with guidance from experts and end users to really maximize implementation and dissemination potential. One of our co-investigators and a close colleague of mine, Laura Anthony, is one of the developers of Unstuck and OnTarget, which I'll say a little bit more about in just a minute. This is an intervention that was developed for school-based delivery, specifically to address executive functioning for autistic youth and youth with ADHD. It has since expanded to many settings, and it's being used with youth with all kinds of emotional and behavioral concerns. But this is one intervention that we are adapting for SITBs for this particular pre-adolescent population, along with the unified protocols for children. This is an intervention that I've co-developed along with colleagues at Miami, notably Jill Ehrenreich-May. And it's an intervention that's designed to address emotion regulation, again, in that 7 to 12 pre-adolescent age range. I think there are a lot of advantages of these two interventions when it comes to adaptation for SITBs. So in addition to targeting executive functioning and emotion regulation, they're both developmentally tailored. They're really designed for the pre-adolescent population rather than being downward extensions of adult interventions. They're designed to be experiential and very activity-based, which we all know is critical for keeping 7 to 12-year-olds engaged. And both contain a caregiver curriculum and or caregiver materials to address caregiver responses that might be helpful to shift to better support kids with emotion regulation and executive functioning. And they also address these key risk and maintaining factors for pre-adolescent SITBs of executive functioning and emotion dysregulation. And so the goal is to work with a number of different experts and end users to figure out how do we adapt components of these interventions to develop an outpatient intervention for pre-adolescents with SITBs, while also integrating safety plan, other specific SITB intervention components, and other strategies that may be helpful. And then our second aim is to pilot the intervention that we develop in a randomized controlled trial with a treatment as usual comparison condition to really evaluate engagement first and foremost, which is our primary outcome. So looking at differences in engagement between conditions. And then also feasibility and acceptability and further adapt the intervention. Our target sample size for the RCT is 52 participants. So not really enough of a sample size and enough power to really look at efficacy, but we're planning to explore initial efficacy in addressing suicidal ideation, non-suicidal self-injury, and suicide attempts at follow-up, and then also looking at engagement of the target mechanisms of EF and emotion regulation. So I want to provide just a little bit of context about why these two interventions and what they are, just to give you a little bit more background for what I've already said in the previous slide. So Unstuck and OnTarget is a school-based executive functioning curriculum, and it was developed by researchers really in close collaboration with school providers, families, and autistic individuals. It was initially developed for this 8 to 11 age range, but there have been expansions for middle schoolers, high schoolers, and for the preschool population. Lots of adaptations already. It has a caregiver curriculum and caregiver materials. And it is really a CBT-based curriculum that emphasizes the Socratic method to build awareness of the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And it uses a lot of home practice and also experiential learning. One thing that's kind of unique about this intervention that feels different from other CBT-based interventions for like anxiety and mood concerns is there's a lot of emphasis on cognitive remediation scripts. So these are really scripts or processes that are aimed to enhance cognitive skills, and they're based off of those used for individuals with neurocognitive impairments. The use of these cognitive remediation scripts, and I'll show you some examples in just a minute, have demonstrated effectiveness for depression, for schizophrenia, for anorexia nervosa, and other sort of populations and clinical concerns. And I think that there are ways in which this could be really helpful for kids with SITBs in terms of supporting with safety planning and skills use. And I can talk about that in just a minute as you see some examples of these scripts. Unstuck really emphasizes viewing behaviors transdiagnostically through an EF lens. And it takes the approach that for a range of diagnoses, EF really plays a central role in contributing to and maintaining symptoms. And that's true not just for ADHD and autism, which are the populations this intervention was originally developed for, but for anxiety and depression. And I think it's true of SITBs too, right? Like if we think about kids with SITBs, especially in this age range, they have a hard time thinking flexibly and using problem solving to resolve stressors. I think they often get stuck on SITBs or other unhelpful thoughts, get stuck on this idea that SITBs are maybe a solution. They act impulsively. And poor planning and disorganization can prevent recall and use of alternative coping and emotion regulation strategies. And so EF, I think, is really useful for thinking about pre-adolescents with SITBs in those ways, and it's helpful to take this EF lens when thinking about some of the challenges and the needs of these particular kids. Here are some examples of these cognitive remediation scripts and this guiding vocabulary. This is really a key component to Unstuck and On Target. It's used throughout the intervention. And so what you see here are these icons, and you'll see these throughout the intervention if you look through this intervention. These icons are sort of meant to draw the attention of the clinician or the intervention deliverer, and kids and families to opportunities to use the target skills in Unstuck related to flexibility, stuckness, plan A, plan B, choice, no choice. And then you'll see these scripts over here on the right. And these are examples of scripts that are meant to be used by the clinician or the interventionist, by families and kids, to really increase recall of skills and to point out opportunities for skills use and to make skills use more automatic. So for example, we can be flexible and make a plan B. I like how you're being flexible. Is that your target goal or a distracting goal? So a lot of encouragement to incorporate these scripts throughout. And I think in thinking about some of these language and some of these scripts, again, I can see how this could be really useful, for supporting things like safety planning and skills use when kids are experiencing, urges to engage in SITBs or emotion dysregulation that might increase risk for engaging in SITBs. Unstuck and On Target also incorporates a lot of predictability and structure. And again, this is really to kind of accommodate some of the EF difficulties of kids for whom this intervention is really targeting. Each session has the same organization. It incorporates guiding structures and scripts. Each session uses this goal, why, plan, do, check framework. And it becomes a constant throughout the intervention, and it's incorporated into homework, again, to really support executive functioning and planning and task monitoring. So another tool that I can see being really helpful in an intervention focused on addressing SITBs in preadolescents with some of these risk factors. So that's Unstuck, in a little bit of rationale and background for why we're focusing on Unstuck. So I'll spend just a couple of minutes talking about why the Unified Protocol for Children and what this intervention is. The Unified Protocol for Children is an intervention, and there's an adolescent version and an adult version. We'll be focusing on the child version for the next couple of minutes. But it's an intervention that really targets core dysfunctions, underlying emotional disorders that can be used in a modular way with really cross-cutting treatment principles that can be used to flexibly address a range of emotional concerns. So anxiety concerns, mood concerns, irritability. The way that we think about the UPC and the other UP interventions in this family is that we are teaching skills and delivering treatment components that address neuroticism. So really this concept, this combination of experiencing intense emotions, difficulty tolerating those intense emotions, unhelpful thoughts, reactions to those intense emotions, which then prompts a lot of emotional avoidance. This can look like behavioral avoidance. It can look like rumination. It can look like engaging in behaviors to take the focus off of the emotional experience. That avoidance makes people feel better in the short term, including kids, which is why they keep engaging in those avoidance strategies. But ultimately, sort of makes things worse in the long run, causes more problems. Obviously, the emotion doesn't go away. Often it just comes back stronger the next time. And so I think we can think about SITBs, whether it be SI, non-suicidal self-injury, as really fitting into this framework and being a form of emotional avoidance for a lot of kids. In terms of sort of what the UP looks like and who it was developed for, kids in the 7 to 12 age range with a primary emotional disorder. We do a lot to make things fun. We use this emotion detectives metaphor throughout the intervention, and clients learn the clues skills. It also contains a fully developed caregiver curriculum that addresses what we call in the UPC emotional caregiver responses. So responses that might contribute to emotional distress or might inadvertently reinforce avoidant behaviors for kids. And we're trying to make caregivers more aware of these responses that tend to be less helpful so that they can shift to what we call opposite caregiver responses. And so the sort of emotional or less helpful caregiver responses are these responses that you see in the triangles. And then in the process, we're really trying to help caregivers increase their tolerance of youth emotional distress, because difficulty tolerating emotional distress and the emotional reaction that the caregiver has, is often partially what prompts some of these less helpful behaviors. And so we have a fully developed curriculum really working on a lot of this. And here's just an example of some, developmentally friendly, materials in the UPC where we're introducing the idea of sort of thinking traps or cognitive distortions to kids. All right. So in this particular project, we're taking these two interventions. We're trying to integrate them, adapt them so that they are relevant for pre-adolescents with SITBs. And the goal is really to create an outpatient intervention. Currently, we're thinking 12 to 15 weeks-ish, although we're continuing to get feedback on intervention length and format. And we're doing this intervention development process using some systematic steps. And so we began by conducting a needs assessment. And so doing some interviews with therapists, with youth, with caregivers, and I'll show you the components of this needs assessment on the next slide to really try to understand the needs of this population and the needs of therapists when working with this population. We are analyzing all of that data now, integrating it with findings from the literature. And the goal is to, based on that needs assessment, develop some prototypes of different intervention materials and activities. We're going to bring back the kids and the caregivers and the therapists who participated in the interviews that we conducted And we're going to do some beta testing, show these materials, guide them through some of these activities, and get their feedback. We'll do at least one of those beta testing sessions, potentially two. And then we'll use all that feedback to produce an initial draft of the intervention. We'll get some feedback from experts again at that point. And then ultimately, we'll do a small uncontrolled pilot trial. And the goal is to start this summer to test out the intervention with some kids and families and to make some additional adaptations, look at feasibility and acceptability. We'll get some more feedback from experts and we'll integrate this feedback into a final intervention draft and therapist training, moving toward this pilot randomized controlled trial around next December, January. That pilot randomized controlled trial, will really be looking at engagement, feasibility, acceptability. We'll collect some more information about what folks think we still need to adapt, and we'll use that information to finalize the intervention for a fully powered effectiveness trial. So that's where we're going and where we are right now. The intervention development process that I just described is being guided by something called intervention mapping. I am guessing some folks in this group may be familiar with intervention mapping. Many of you may not. Very briefly, what this is it's a systematic approach to program development, implementation, and evaluation, and it kind of provides a framework and steps for decision making about how to develop and adapt interventions. And it kind of guides you on how to use theory and empirical evidence and expert and community input to develop and adapt interventions. It really takes an ecological approach and focuses on how to address changing the behavior of people in the environment and how to address really the complexity of multi-causation of problems and multi-level intervention points. And it has 6 steps. So for intervention mapping, the first thing you're doing is you're developing what's called a logic model of the problem. We've drafted this already, and this is what I really want to get folks' feedback on today. And I'll talk in just a minute about how we're going to do that. Then after the logic model of the problem, you create this logic model of change. So thinking about, I've now kind of mapped out or understood, what the problem is and what's contributing to the problem across some of those different levels. Now we're going to flip it and think about what needs to change in order to change the behavior of individuals that the intervention is for. After you've created those logic models, you design the program production, you create an implementation plan and an evaluation plan. And I won't say much about those later steps because we're really kind of focusing on step 1 right now. And so for step 1, we've been working with a small planning group here. We've completed an initial needs assessment to develop a logic model of the problem, which I'll show you in just a second. And then we're working on kind of really figuring out what's the intervention context, specifically what's the population and setting. Right now this is looking like an outpatient intervention around 12 to 15 sessions. We're continuing to get feedback on that and working on stating problem goals. As I mentioned before, for our needs assessment, we've completed some semi-structured interviews with therapists, really finding out more about their experiences with preadolescents, with SITBs, how they approach treatment, what kinds of training have they had, what are training gaps, what are the interventions they're using, what are some of the perceived barriers and facilitators. And then we also completed a therapist survey and we recruited nationally. This was completed on REDCap and therapists answered some quantitative surveys, but also provided some free text responses. And the questions on the survey assess their knowledge of SITBs and preadolescents, confidence working with preadolescents with SITBs, experiences in assessing and treating kids with SITBs, barriers to treatment. And then currently we are still in the process of conducting interviews with kids and caregivers, hoping to finish that part up this month. And so we're almost finished with this needs assessment that's intended to form that logic model of the problem. Okay. What does a logic model of the problem look like? In intervention mapping, this is sort of the core template that you can modify to fit the particular intervention that you're developing. But you're really kind of starting over here on the right, where you're thinking about what's the health problem that we're trying to address. Then you're thinking about what's the behavior of the at-risk group or the target of the intervention. So, what are people either doing or not doing that's contributing to the health problem? So, this piece really focuses on behaviors. And then you're thinking about personal determinants or drivers. So, what are the kind of psychological factors or other factors that cause those behaviors of the at-risk group that contribute to the health problem? And then you're thinking about other levels. So within the environment, what are environmental conditions? And then what are the behaviors of family members, friends on the interpersonal level, organizational clinicians, schools that are contributing to that health problem or contributing to those behaviors of the at-risk group? And then what are kind of the determinants or factors that contribute to the behaviors of people in the environment? So really trying to map this out systematically. And so we've done this process. And so we have created an initial logic model of the problem. You don't need to study this slide right now because I have put this on a Miro board and I've broken this up into sections. But this is our initial messy logic model of the problem that's derived from that needs assessment process that we've completed. And so, just to kind of take you through big picture, the health problem that we're focusing on is suicidal behavior, non-suicidal self-injury, and suicide attempts specifically for pre-adolescents. We've spent some time thinking about what are the behaviors that pre-adolescents are either engaging in or not engaging in that are contributing to that health problem. So, SIPBs that we're focusing on. And then what are some of the psychological determinants or factors that are contributing on the individual level for the pre-adolescent to those behaviors? Then, based on our needs assessment, we've really thought about on the environmental level, what are the behaviors specifically of family members and peers that are either contributing to the pre-adolescent behaviors directly or to some of these pre-adolescent determinants that influence behaviors? And then we've thought about what are the determinants for those environmental actors. So caregivers and families specifically, because really those are the determinants that we wanted to address in the intervention. It's probably going to be hard to address those peer level determinants, even though there might be behaviors that peers are engaging in that contribute to the pre-adolescent determinants or pre-adolescent behaviors. And then we're also thinking about on the clinic level, on the school level, same thing, sort of what are the behaviors that agents are either engaging in or not engaging in that are contributing, and what are the determinants for those behaviors. And so what we're going to do is we are going to use a Miro board, and I'm going to ask for specific feedback about each of these pieces of the logic model. And so to get to the Miro board, you can scan the QR code. That should take you there. Or I'm not sure if folks can click on this link, but I can definitely put this in the chat if that would be helpful.
That'd be great if you put it in the chat, Sarah. I think
Yeah,
it'll
let me
be
go
Yeah, if
try
you
to
could
do
drop it
that.
in the chat, that'd be great.
Sure. Okay, let me get out of presenter mode.
I think I can do it too if that's easier.
Oh, awesome. If you've got it up already, Molly, that would be great. Otherwise,
Yep, does it look
there we
like
go.
oh, okay. You've got it.
Perfect. Okay, let me get this back in presenter mode. Okay, so at this stage, why am I asking for feedback? We're trying to do a couple things. We're trying to validate the results of our needs assessment and sort of validate the different components in this logic model. So looking for feedback from another expert group to do this. We're really trying to figure out what are we missing? So what are the missing behaviors and what are the missing determinants of behaviors? We're wanting to clarify pathways. I think this part is really a little bit underdeveloped just in terms of thinking about, are there specific pathways within some of these broader categories that we really should be considering or thinking about? And then finally, we're also really trying to prioritize determinants for intervention. As you probably noticed, it's a messy logic model at this point. We've identified a lot of determinants across lots of different levels, and we will not be able to address all of these things in an intervention. So we're really looking for feedback on what should we prioritize and what seems the most salient to you in terms of importance. And what are we actually going to be able to change too? Because some of the determinants that we've identified may be less changeable or malleable than others. And so for this activity, what we would like folks to do is when you go into the Miro board, you'll see the logic model of the problem that I just showed you on the left. And then if you move across the board to the right, there are 3 panels. So there's a panel that focuses first on the individual level. So just what are the behaviors of preadolescents that contribute to the problem and what are the determinants of those behaviors? Then next, there's a panel that focuses on the interpersonal level. So this is the family peer level, both behaviors and determinants. And then there's a final panel that focuses on the organizational level. So here we've really tried to map out what are the behaviors of clinicians, schools that contribute, and what are the determinants. And what I would love for people to do is use the sticky notes that you see in each panel. And you can also pop more in if you run out of sticky notes to indicate a couple of things. So pink, what is missing? What's not in the logic model that we need to be thinking about? Yellow is suggestions or just like thoughts about conceptual reorganization. And then green would be things that you think we should prioritize for the intervention. And so I think we probably have time to spend about 3 to 5 minutes on each panel. And then there's also a parking lot panel on the very end for feedback that doesn't really fit into any other panel. So what I'll do is I'm going to pull up and screen share the Miro board to kind of move people through the panels. And there's also a timer. I'll set a timer maybe for about 4 minutes for each panel and would love any and all feedback you have. So let me stop sharing this. And I'm
Looks
happy
great.
to address questions at
People
any
are in
point.
there, and looks like 18 people are in there and doing their thing. So that's wonderful.
Amazing. I was playing around with Miro, and I'll screen share this in a second. I also discovered that there is a timer, which is helpful, and also music. And was testing out the different music settings. I'll put on the one that it feels like the consensus of like, the small group that was in this meeting determined was the best for this activity, but I can also turn it off if it ends up being too distracting.
Okay, I now have a prompt that says presentation started by Sarah Kennedy. Should I join or say not now?
Maybe say not now. I can
Okay.
stop doing this too if this ends up causing problems.
Nope, I'll just click not now. I wasn't sure what to do.
Okay. Let me just sign on. I think chill beats. So let me know if the music is distracting. And you can mute it too.
The perfect vibe for sorting personal
We tried.
determinants.
Some just did not seem right.
Are we all staying on the personal ones, the first one to the left, or going all over?
Good question. If you want to move, you can feel free to move. I've just pulled up personal determinants because I think, 3 to 4 minutes on each panel sounds about right time-wise. But if you feel
Perfect.
compelled to go somewhere
Okay.
else, please go somewhere else.
No, thank you. I just want to use my time smartly.
Okay, another question, Sarah. I just noticed I put something very similar to someone else. So should I move it to be next to their sticky or just remove it and put like another little check by it that I agree with what they.
Great question. I would say definitely don't worry about the arrangement. Our
Okay,
team can rearrange things later. I think if it's the same as somebody else's, you could either leave it there. I think it's helpful feedback for us that like multiple people are suggesting, the same thing, or you could do some sort of like star if that makes more sense too, but indicating in some way that you agree.
cool.
I may leave the chill beats off. It may be a little much. So I'm going to move over to the next frame. If you still want to be on the last frame and you have more feedback, you don't need to move. But just looking at time, want to move us over to spend a couple of minutes on this one. Okay, and again, just given the time, I'm going to move over to this final panel. So it may be a good time to switch, and we'll spend just a couple of minutes on this one. While folks are doing this, I might just pull up the final, I think I have like one more slide, to just give you some orientation to the next steps of our process. But why don't you go ahead, if you haven't already, and take a look at the clinic and the school level. So as folks are wrapping up with the last panel, I'll just talk for a minute about what our next steps are going to be as a team. So the feedback that you're all providing is super helpful and is really important for our team. So thank you, thank you. We're going to use this feedback to update the logic model of the problem. And then we can plan to send out an updated logic model to today's attendees, just so that you can all see how we end up incorporating some of your feedback. So Molly, Macy, maybe I'll work with both of you to kind of figure out how to get that to folks. We do not expect any additional feedback at that stage or ever, but if you do take a look at it and have any feedback or think there's something that we really, need to reconsider or add, we would always welcome it. And then our internal working group will finalize that logic model of the problem and create kind of the flip, which is that logic model of change. So now we've mapped out the problem. What do we need to change? How do the determinants need to change the behaviors? And we'll figure out what we need to prioritize in this intervention and start to work on developing some of those initial prototypes. So those are our next steps. I know we are just about out of time. And wanted to just kind of open things up as you're wrapping up with the Mira board to see if anyone has any reflections. So general feedback, any questions for me, or suggestions for improving a feedback process like this in the future. This is sort of the first time that we're trying this out. So if you have feedback for me and for our team about that, we would appreciate it too.
Well, people are thinking we maybe have time for one or two questions. Just want to thank you, Sarah, for a great presentation. It's fun to have an activity like this where we can think deeply about the intervention that you're doing and have a opportunity to react. And I am just impressed by the integration of the interventions and the potential here. I think our whole group can consider if the people we're treating now had this intervention when they were 7 to 12, you could prevent a lot of more serious problems developing.
Yeah.
I see Kate had unmuted. Did you want to ask a question or comment, Kate?
Yeah, I think this is some of the best use of sort of RDoC mechanism based thinking. So often that's seems like it's so plastered on top of something, including my own stuff, plastered on top of something rather than from the ground up. And I really, really appreciate that. And we've been kind of doing mirror board based stuff, and I'm still not very savvy with it, but I definitely appreciated um, kind of the way that you're gathering information from other folks, and love to have you come back and present as you kind of move on to actually getting to the development of the of it, because we're developing it using a different sort of framework, and it's really helpful to reflect on kind of how we're doing it versus how you're doing it.
Amazing. Thank you for that feedback, Kate. That means a lot to me. I would love to come back myself and maybe with some members of our team and provide some updates as we're developing the logic model of change and some of those intervention prototypes. So I would love to come back anytime you all have me. You would all have me, and anytime you have space for a presenter. So Molly, I'll connect with you and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But thanks so much for the feedback, Kate. I'm new to Mira board too, so this is very much experimental for me.
I was proud of all of us for navigating it without Lucas, our human-centered design expert, holding
Yeah.
our hand.
Yeah, it went remarkably smoothly. I don't know if it felt that way for you all, but for me, more smoothly than I feared. And you have the link too. So again, no expectation, but if anybody, has some additional feedback or, you have a middle of the night idea, would definitely, welcome you to come back to the Mira board and add input if that's something that you like to do or feel compelled to do.
I would be super curious what the young people would make of all the elements in the model if they could be sort of I'm very curious how as you go forward and they respond, because I found myself thinking it's probably not my opinion that matters here. It's probably,
Mhm.
the 11-year-old's opinion that's
Yes.
really, so I'll be really curious what they pick.
Yeah, me too, Kate. And we're planning at least one design session, but we're gonna try, I think, to fit in two, at least with some of the kids and families. We've had 12 clinicians in our needs assessment, and we're going for 12 clinicians and families too. And I will also be really curious to see what they think of some of this. My collaborator, Laura Anthony, who's one of the co-developers of Unstuck, when they were developing that intervention, they worked really closely with autistic co-collaborators and teachers and OTs to develop that intervention. When we developed the UPC, we really didn't do that. And I think some of the desire to really engage as many folks as possible comes from realizing, the things about the UPC that don't work as well. And I think part of the reason why they don't work as well or don't land as well is because, we were missing some of that feedback during that early development process. And then, of course, once you publish an intervention and there's an evidence base, it becomes hard to change things too. So trying to avoid being in that position again in terms of intervention development. All right. Well, thank you again so much, everybody. Our team will synthesize this information and we'll kind of send out a report and an updated logic model within the coming weeks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. It was a
So,
pleasure to have you with us today.
yeah,
Appreciate you sharing your
pleasure for me too. Hi, Eileen. Good to see you too.
work.